A terrified bear had never felt a gentle hand until this man changed everything. The old chain marks were still visible on Willow's right foreleg, a permanent reminder of her captivity when the wildlife officers first found her in that dilapidated tourist camp outside Bend, Oregon. She had been chained to a concrete slab, her once glossy black fur matted with dirt and her own waste. The metal links had rubbed her skin raw over the years, leaving a ring of scar tissue that would never fully heal. But it wasn't just physical scars that marked the North American black bear, the psychological wounds ran much deeper. Willow had been a cub when poachers took her, barely old enough to forage on her own. The men who captured her had killed her mother, leaving the young bear orphaned and terrified. For 4 years after that, Willow's world consisted of a 10 by 10 concrete pad, the constant click of tourist cameras, and the sting of the cattle prod whenever she didn't cooperate for photos. The operation had been running illegally for years on private land, charging visitors $20 to pose with the tame a bear. There was nothing tame about Willow, she had simply been broken. When the wildlife rescue team finally raided the property after an anonymous tip, they found Willow cowering in the corner of her enclosure, growling weakly at anyone who approached. Her ribs protruded through her dull coat, and fresh wounds on her snout showed where a muzzle had been fastened too tightly. The veterinarian who first examined her estimated she was only about 5 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of an animal many times that age. "She's severely malnourished," Dr. Lane Summers had told the rescue team as they prepared to transport Willow to Evergreen Wildlife Sanctuary. "And I'm concerned about infection in some of these wounds, but physically she can recover. Mentally." She had trailed off, watching as the sedated bear was carefully loaded into the transport cage. That's going to be the real challenge. Evergreen Wildlife Sanctuary sat on 40 acres of protected forest land just outside Portland. Founded 15 years earlier by Drive Howard Reed, it had become one of the premier rehabilitation centers for injured and traumatized wildlife in the Pacific Northwest. Howard had dedicated his life to the sanctuary after leaving his lucrative veterinary practice in Seattle, converting his considerable savings and a generous inheritance into the sprawling facility that now housed everything from orphaned deer fawns to rehabilitating raptors. But in all his years of wildlife rescue, Howard had never seen an animal as psychologically damaged as Willow. "She won't eat unless everyone's gone from the area," he told his staff during their morning meeting a week after Willow's arrival. "And even then, she only picks at the food. She's lost another 2 pounds since she got here." Melissa Chen, the sanctuary's head keeper, nodded grimly. "She charged the fence when I tried to clean her water trough yesterday. Not aggressively, more like panic. She was terrified of the hose." "Water torture," muttered Jim Reeves, the sanctuary's most experienced handler. "I've seen it before in bears from those tourist traps. They use high-pressure hoses to control them." Howard ran a hand through his graying hair, his face lined with concern. "We can't sedate her for every interaction. That will just compound the trauma, but at this rate, she's going to starve herself." "What about Walter?" Melissa suggested after a moment of silence. "He's had success with some of our most difficult cases." Howard considered this. Walter Miller had been volunteering at the sanctuary for nearly 3 years now, ever since his wife's death. The retired veterinarian rarely spoke about his past, but his gentle way with the animals had proven invaluable time and again. Just last year, he'd managed to hand-feed an orphan mountain lion cub that had rejected all other human contact. "It's worth a try," Howard finally agreed. I'll give him a call this afternoon. Walter Miller lived alone in a small cabin about 20 minutes from the sanctuary. Built in the 1940s, the wooden structure sat nestled among towering Douglas firs, its weathered exterior blending into the forest around it. A narrow gravel driveway led up to the cabin, ending at a small clearing where Walter's ancient Ford pickup truck was parked. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean. Photographs lined the mantel above the stone fireplace, Walter and his late wife Sarah on their wedding day, their children now grown and living in distant cities, grandchildren Walter rarely saw. In the corner stood a bookshelf filled with veterinary texts and well-worn paperback novels. Beside it, propped against the wall, was Walter's old Martin guitar, the wood polished by decades of handling. When Howard's call came that afternoon, Walter had been sitting on his porch, watching a family of chickadees at the bird feeder. He listened quietly as Howard described Willow's condition and the sanctuary's concerns. "I don't know if anyone can reach her, Walter," Howard concluded. "But if anyone has a chance, I think it's you." Walter's gnarled fingers traced the grain of the wooden porch railing as he considered the request. Since Sarah's death from pancreatic cancer 4 years earlier, he had retreated further and further from human contact. The depression that followed her passing had nearly consumed him. There had been days, even weeks, when he hadn't bothered to get out of bed. When the thought of continuing without her had seemed impossible. It was his daughter Rebecca who had finally intervened, driving up from California to find her father living in squalor, barely eating, his once robust frame gaunt and frail. She had cleaned the cabin, restocked the refrigerator, and before leaving, had made one request: "Find something to care about again, Dad. Mom wouldn't want you to disappear like this." 2 months later, Walter had shown up at Evergreen Wildlife Sanctuary, offering his services as a volunteer. Working with the animals gave structure to his days, a reason to get up in the morning, and somewhere along the way, the raw edge of his grief had begun to soften. "I'll come tomorrow morning," Walter told Howard. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try." "That's all we can ask," Howard replied, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, Walter." The next morning, dawn clear and cool, the September air crisp with the first hint of autumn. Walter arrived at the sanctuary just after sunrise, parking his truck near the administrative building. From the bed of the pickup, he carefully removed his guitar case, slinging it over his shoulder before heading toward the bear enclosures. Howard met him outside Willow's habitat, a spacious pen with a small concrete shelter at one end and several fallen logs and large rocks arranged throughout. A high fence surrounded the enclosure, topped with electric wire, standard protocol for predator habitats. Through the chain link, Walter could see a dark shape huddled in the far corner, partially hidden behind one of the logs. "She's been like that since we transferred her here," Howard explained quietly. "Barely moves except at night when no one's around. The cameras show she paces sometimes after dark, but mostly she just stays in that corner." Walter nodded, studying the bear's posture, head down, shoulders hunched, making herself as small as possible. Classic signs of severe trauma. "I'd like to be alone with her," he said. Howard hesitated. "Are you sure?" "She's unpredictable, Walter. We don't even know if she'll respond to you." "She won't, not at first," Walter replied simply. "But she needs to get used to me without feeling surrounded. Too many people will just reinforce her fear." After a moment, Howard nodded. "All right, I'll have someone check on you every hour or so, but they'll stay back. Just be careful, okay?" She may look defeated, but she's still a wild animal. When Howard had gone, Walter settled himself on a small folding stool about 10 feet from the enclosure fence. He didn't look directly at Willow, instead focusing on removing his guitar from its case and quietly tuning the strings. From the corner of his eye, he saw the bear shift slightly, one ear twitching at the unfamiliar sounds. Walter didn't speak. He didn't try to coax Willow with treats or soft words as others might have done. Instead, he simply began to play a gentle, meandering melody that floated on the morning air. His fingers, stiff with arthritis but still nimble enough for simple songs, moved slowly across the strings. For nearly an hour, Walter played without pause, one tune flowing into the next, folk songs Sarah had loved, lullabies he'd sung to his children decades ago, simple compositions of his own. When his fingers finally grew too sore to continue, he carefully returned the guitar to its case and stood, his joints protesting after sitting so long in the cool morning air. Willow hadn't moved from her corner, hadn't given any indication that she even noticed his presence. But Walter hadn't expected her to. Not yet. Trust would come slowly, if it came at all. "See you tomorrow," he said quietly, the first words he'd spoken since arriving. Then he gathered his things and walked away, not looking back. The next morning, Walter returned with his guitar and something else, a small bunch of lavender tied with twine, freshly cut from the patch that grew beside his cabin. Sarah had planted it years ago, saying the scent reminded her of her childhood in southern France. Walter had tended it carefully after her death, one of the few routines he'd maintained during those dark months. He placed the lavender on the ground near the fence, then took his seat and began to play again. Willow remained in her corner, though Walter thought her posture seemed slightly less rigid than the day before. When he left that day, he left the lavender behind. Day after day, Walter returned. Sometimes he played for an hour, sometimes for 3 or 4, depending on how his hands felt and what he sensed from Willow. He always brought fresh lavender, placing it in the same spot near the fence. The sanctuary staff watched his routine with a mixture of respect and skepticism. After 2 weeks with no visible progress, some began to wonder if Howard had been right. Perhaps Willow was simply too traumatized to reach. "She's eating more," Melissa reported during a staff meeting in early October. "Not much, but her weight stabilized, and she's been using more of the enclosure at night, according to the cameras." "Still no direct interaction with Walter?" Howard asked. Melissa shook her head. "Not that we've seen, but she doesn't growl when he approaches anymore. That's something, at least." Walter himself said little about his sessions with Willow. When asked, he would simply shrug and say, "She'll let me know when she's ready." Inside, though, he noticed every small change, the way her eyes now tracked his movements, how she would sometimes lift her head when he began to play a particular melody, the fact that the lavender disappeared overnight rather than being left to wither. The breakthrough came on a cold, rainy morning in late October. Walter had debated staying home, his arthritis was particularly painful in the damp weather, and the thought of sitting in the rain held little appeal. But routine was important, both for Willow and for himself. So he pulled on his old waxed canvas coat, covered his guitar case with a plastic tarp, and made the drive to Evergreen. By the time he reached Willow's enclosure, the drizzle had turned into a steady downpour. Walter set up his stool under the partial shelter of a nearby pine tree, though it did little to keep the rain off. His fingers were stiff and cold as he began to play, the notes not flowing as smoothly as usual. The storm intensified as he played, wind driving the rain sideways in heavy sheets. Walter hunched over his guitar, trying to protect it with his body, but water still dripped from his beard onto the wooden soundboard. He was about to give up, to pack away the instrument before it was damaged, when movement caught his eye. Willow had left her corner for the first time since Walter had begun his visits. She was approaching the fence, moving slowly but deliberately through the rain. She stopped about 3 feet from the barrier, her dark eyes fixed on Walter, water streaming down her black fur. Walter's fingers stilled on the strings. He sat motionless, barely breathing as the bear studied him. Then carefully, he set the guitar aside and moved to kneel by the fence. Rainwater soaked through his jeans, but he barely noticed. Slowly, telegraphing every movement, he extended his hand through the chain link, palm up, fingers slightly curled. For a long moment, Willow didn't move. Then, with a hesitation that spoke volumes about her past, she took one step forward, another. Her nose twitched as she scented the air. Walter remained perfectly still, his weathered hands steady despite the cold and his pounding heart. Finally, Willow stretched her neck forward, her wet nose just touching the tip of Walter's extended finger. The contact lasted only a second before she withdrew, backing away several steps, but remaining in the open rather than retreating to her corner. Walter felt wetness on his cheeks that had nothing to do with the rain. How long had it been since he'd cried? Not since Sarah's funeral, he thought. And those had been tears of despair, of a future suddenly empty and meaningless. These tears were different. They carried something he had thought lost forever, hope. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Good girl, Willow." The bear's ear twitched at the sound of her name, but she didn't flee. Instead, she settled onto her haunches, watching Walter with what almost looked like curiosity. They stayed like that, man and bear, in the pouring rain, connected by something fragile but unmistakable, the first thread of trust. When Walter finally left that day, soaked to the skin and shivering but somehow lighter than he had felt in years, he knew they had crossed an important threshold. The real work of healing, for both of them, could now begin. News of the breakthrough spread quickly through the sanctuary staff. Howard was cautiously optimistic, though he warned against expecting too much too soon. "Bears have excellent memories," he told Walter the next day. "Especially of trauma. One positive interaction doesn't erase years of abuse." "I know," Walter replied. "But it's a start." In the weeks that followed, Willow's progress continued slowly but steadily. She began to approach the fence whenever Walter arrived, sometimes sitting just a few feet away as he played. She would accept pieces of apple or berries from his hand, taking them delicately between her lips. The growling stopped entirely, replaced by a soft huffing sound that Walter came to recognize as her greeting. "She needs more space," Walter told Howard in mid-November. "More natural surroundings. That concrete pad in her shelter? It probably reminds her of where she was kept before." Howard frowned. "We can't just release her into a larger enclosure, Walter. She's still unpredictable with other staff members." "Not a full release," Walter clarified. "But what about that old exercise yard behind the rehabilitation center? The one with the trees and the small stream. If we secured it properly, it would give her a chance to relearn some natural behaviors in a controlled environment." The idea had merit. Howard had to admit the area Walter mentioned had been used years earlier for rehabilitating smaller mammals but had fallen into disuse when newer facilities were built. With some updates to the fencing and security, it could work as a transitional space for Willow. It'll take time to prepare, Howard cautioned. And money we don't necessarily have budgeted. Walter's response was immediate. I'll pay for it, and I'll help with the work. Howard studied his friend's face, the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw. In the months since Walter had begun working with Willow, Howard had noticed changes in the older man. He stood straighter. The perpetual sadness that had hung about him like a shroud had lifted somewhat. He spoke more, smiled occasionally. Howard suspected that Walter needed Willow's recovery as much as the bear did. All right, Howard agreed. We'll call it the Forest Recovery Corner, but, he added, raising a cautionary finger, we proceed carefully. Safety protocols remain in place, and if at any point she shows regression or aggression, we reevaluate. Deal, Walter nodded, already envisioning the space and what Willow would need. Deal. The transformation of the old exercise yard took nearly 3 weeks of hard work. Walter was there every day, helping to clear overgrown vegetation, repair the perimeter fence, and install additional security measures. When he wasn't physically working on the space, he was researching natural enrichment activities for bears in rehabilitation, consulting with experts at other wildlife sanctuaries, even reaching out to his son Michael, an engineer in Boston, for advice on creating a small but functional artificial stream. By early December, the Forest Recovery Corner was ready. The half-acre space contained several mature trees, boulder formations for climbing, a shallow pool fed by a small recirculating stream, and various hiding spots for food and toys. The entire perimeter was secured with 12-foot fencing topped with inward-facing electric wire, and multiple security cameras provided constant monitoring. Transferring Willow to her new environment was a delicate operation. Despite her progress with Walter, she still reacted with fear to most other humans and to any changes in her routine. The sanctuary staff decided that sedation would be too stressful, potentially undoing months of careful trust building. Instead, they would try to lure her voluntarily into a transport crate, using Walter's presence as reassurance. On the morning of the transfer, Walter arrived earlier than usual, his guitar case in one hand and a small basket in the other. From the basket, he removed several items, a bunch of fresh lavender, a jar of honey, and a red bandana that he tied around his neck. The scent markers will help her recognize me and feel secure, he explained to Howard, who had come to oversee the transfer. And she associates the color red with positive experiences now. I've been wearing something red every day for the past month. Howard nodded, impressed as always by Walter's attention to detail when it came to Willow's care. The transport crate is in position, he said, gesturing to where a large metal crate had been attached to the gate of Willow's enclosure. We've left both doors open so she has a clear path through. Once she's inside, Melissa will close the rear door remotely. Walter positioned himself at the far end of the transport crate, visible to Willow but at a distance that wouldn't make her feel cornered. He began to play his guitar, choosing a melody that had become one of Willow's favorites, a simple folk tune with a gentle, repeating chorus. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened. Willow watched from her usual spot near the fence, occasionally shifting her weight but making no move toward the crate. Walter continued playing, his expression serene despite the tension that filled the air. Then slowly, Willow rose to her feet. She approached the open crate cautiously, sniffing the air, her powerful shoulders tense with readiness to retreat. Walter's playing never faltered, though his eyes remained fixed on the bear, communicating calm reassurance. Willow took one step into the crate, then another. She paused, looking back toward her familiar enclosure, then forward again at Walter. With a soft huff, she committed to her decision, moving fully into the transport container. The moment she was clear of the threshold, Melissa activated the remote control. The rear door slid closed with a soft click, securing Willow inside. The bear startled slightly at the sound but didn't panic as they had feared she might. Instead, her attention remained focused on Walter, who had smoothly transitioned to another familiar tune. "Transport team ready," Howard spoke quietly into his radio. "Proceed to the recovery corner." Four staff members appeared, lifting the crate with practiced efficiency onto a wheeled platform. Walter walked alongside as they began the short journey to Willow's new home, never stopping his playing, never breaking eye contact with the bear. When they reached the forest recovery corner, the team positioned the crate at the entrance gate. Walter moved inside the enclosure first, settling himself on a log about 20 feet from the gate. Only when he was in position did Howard signal for the crate to be opened. For a long moment after the door slid up, Willow remained motionless inside the transport container. Then cautiously, she emerged, her nose working overtime to process all the new scents. She took a few steps into the enclosure, then stopped, her head swinging from side to side as she surveyed her new surroundings. Walter continued to play, providing an anchor of familiarity in the strange environment. Gradually, Willow began to explore, moving in an ever-widening circle from the entrance. She sniffed at the trees, pawed at the soft earth, and approached the stream with particular interest. All the while, she kept Walter in her peripheral vision, occasionally glancing his way as if to reassure herself of his presence. The sanctuary staff watched from the monitoring station, their expressions a mixture of awe and professional satisfaction. On the screens before them, they saw not the terrified, aggressive bear that had arrived at Evergreen, but an animal beginning to remember what it meant to be wild. "I'll be damned," murmured Jim Reeves, the veteran handler who had been most skeptical of Walter's methods. "The old man actually did it." Howard smiled, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "He started it," he corrected. "But there's still a long way to go before she's ready for release, if she ever can be." In the enclosure, Walter had set aside his guitar. Willow had approached the log where he sat, her massive head level with his knee, carefully moving with deliberate slowness. Walter extended his hand. The bear sniffed his fingers, then pressed her nose against his palm, a gesture of trust that brought an audible gasp from the watching staff. "Look at that," Melissa whispered. "She's not afraid of him at all anymore." As they watched, Willow settled onto the ground beside Walter's log, rolling onto her back in a display of vulnerability none of them had expected to see. Walter reached down, gently scratching the bear's chest. Willow's eyes half closed in contentment. "No," Howard agreed quietly. "She's not afraid, but the question remains, is she too habituated now? Has the pendulum swung too far in the other direction?" It was a valid concern, one that would need careful monitoring in the months ahead. For now, though, Howard was content to celebrate the victory before them, a traumatized animal finding peace, and an isolated old man finding purpose. The winter months brought new challenges and new progress. Willow thrived in the forest recovery corner, gaining weight and muscle tone as she explored her expanded territory. Walter visited daily, often spending hours in the enclosure with her. Under his gentle guidance, she began to rediscover her natural behaviors, digging for roots, fishing in the stream, even climbing the smaller trees. Walter worked closely with the sanctuary staff to develop enrichment activities that would stimulate Willow's instincts. They created puzzles filled with hidden treats that required her to use her claws and sense of smell to solve. They introduced different scents and textures, helping her reconnect with sensory experiences she would encounter in the wild. They varied her diet to include all the food she would need to forage for if released. As Willow's confidence grew, so did Walter's. The stooped, withdrawn man who had first volunteered at the sanctuary was barely recognizable in the animated figure who now arrived, each morning with new ideas and observations to share. He had begun keeping detailed journals of Willow's progress, noting every behavior, every milestone, every setback. "You should consider publishing your methods," Howard suggested one evening as they reviewed Willow's latest medical assessment. "What you've accomplished with her could help rehabilitation efforts elsewhere." Walter shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "I haven't done anything special. Just gave her time and space to heal in her own way." "And music," Howard added with a smile. "Don't forget the music." It was true, Walter still played for Willow nearly every day, and she still responded to certain melodies with visible enjoyment. But increasingly, the guitar was becoming less necessary as a bridge between them. Their connection now transcended the notes, built on months of patient trust-building and mutual respect. The real test came in January during one of the coldest nights of the winter. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing, and a bitter wind whipped through the sanctuary. The heating system in Willow's shelter malfunctioned, leaving her exposed to the elements in a way her wild counterparts would be prepared for, but she, with her years in captivity, was not. The night security guard discovered the problem during his rounds and immediately called Howard, who lived on the sanctuary grounds. Howard, in turn, called Walter. "I'm on my way," Walter said without hesitation, already pulling on his coat. "Have the maintenance team meet me there with portable heaters." By the time Walter arrived, Willow was showing signs of distress. She paced the enclosure, shivering visibly, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The maintenance crew had brought several propane heaters, but were unable to place them inside the enclosure. Willow's agitation made it too dangerous for them to enter. Walter assessed the situation quickly. "I'm going in," he told Howard, who had joined them at the site. "She knows me. She'll let me help her." Howard looked skeptical. "Walter, she's cold and scared. Even with your relationship, that's a dangerous combination." "I trust her," Walter said simply. And before Howard could object further, he had unlocked the access gate and slipped inside the enclosure. Willow stopped her pacing when she saw him, huffing loudly in what sounded almost like relief. Walter approached slowly, speaking in the low, gentle voice he always used with her. "It's all right, girl. I'm here to help. Let's get you warm." To the amazement of the watching staff, Willow allowed Walter to guide her into her shelter. He set up the portable heaters at a safe distance, creating a pocket of warmth in the small space. Then, settling himself on the concrete floor, he began to play his guitar, not the usual melodies, but a slower, almost hypnotic tune that seemed to calm Willow's shivering. Gradually, the bear relaxed, lying down beside Walter, her massive body radiating trust. Walter continued to play, his fingers stiff with cold but determined. And when Willow finally dozed off, her head resting against his leg, Walter simply leaned back against the wall of the shelter and closed his eyes as well. Howard found them like that when he checked in the early morning, the old man and the bear sleeping peacefully side by side, the guitar still cradled in Walter's lap. He stood watching them for a long moment, then quietly withdrew, leaving instructions that they were not to be disturbed. When Walter awoke several hours later, stiff and cold but somehow content, he found Willow already awake, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes. He reached out to stroke her head, and she pressed into his touch like a house cat seeking affection. "We made it through, didn't we, girl?" he murmured. And in that moment, looking into Willow's trusting gaze, Walter knew what needed to happen next, the hardest step of all. The discussion with Howard later that day was difficult but necessary. "She's ready, Howard," Walter insisted, his voice firm despite the emotion behind it. "She's healthy. She's regained her natural behaviors, and she's still wary enough of other humans to keep her safe." Howard sighed, leaning back in his office chair. "Walter, I understand your attachment to her, but this isn't about attachment." Walter interrupted. "It's about what's right for Willow. She deserves a chance at a real life, not just a better cage. And if she can't adapt, if she approaches humans looking for food or interaction, you know how that usually ends for bears." Walter nodded gravely. He did know. Bears that lost their fear of humans often became problem animals, eventually being euthanized when they became too bold or destructive. "That's why we need to do this right," he said. "A soft release in a remote area with tracking and monitoring. Cascade National Park has those deep wilderness zones where human contact would be minimal, and their wildlife management team is experienced with bear reintroductions." Howard studied his friend's face, recognizing the determination there. "You've already researched all this, haven't you?" "For the past month," Walter admitted. "I've been in contact with the park's head biologist. They're willing to work with us, provided Willow passes their behavioral assessments." After a long pause, Howard nodded slowly. "All right, we'll start the process. But Walter," he added, his voice softening, "are you sure you're ready to let her go?" Walter looked away, his throat tight. The question cut to the heart of what these months with Willow had meant to him. She had become more than a rehabilitation project, she had been his own salvation, pulling him back from the brink of despair after Sarah's death. The thought of saying goodbye to her permanently was almost unbearable. But he knew it was the right thing to do. Willow deserved freedom. Real freedom. Not the limited version he could provide within the sanctuary's fences. "No," he finally answered honestly. "I'm not ready, but I will be, because she is." The preparation for Willow's release took nearly 2 months. There were assessments to complete, paperwork to file, logistics to arrange. Walter threw himself into every aspect of the process, working closely with both the sanctuary staff and the national park team to ensure everything was perfect. He also intensified Willow's wilderness training. With Howard's approval, he began hiding food throughout the recovery corner in increasingly challenging locations, forcing Willow to use her natural foraging skills to find it. He reduced his time in the enclosure, gradually accustoming her to longer periods without human contact. He even introduced recordings of potential predator sounds, mountain lions, wolves, humans with dogs, to gauge and strengthen her appropriate fear responses. Through it all, Willow continued to thrive. Her coat grew thick and glossy with health. Her movements became more confident and purposeful, and her natural wariness of humans other than Walter remained strong, all positive signs for her potential success in the wild. Finally, in early April, the day arrived. The transport to Cascade National Park would take several hours, and Walter insisted on accompanying Willow the entire way. The park biologists had selected a remote valley for the release, an area rich in natural bear foods and far from hiking trails or campgrounds. The morning was clear and cool. Willow blinked, the sunlight dappling through the tall firs, a stark contrast to the sterile concrete and chain link she'd known for so long. Walter opened the rear door of the transport crate, and she hesitated, a lifetime of conditioned fear warring with the wild instincts stirring within her. "Go on, girl," Walter murmured, his voice a gentle anchor in the vastness of her new world. "You're home." With a final, deep breath that filled her lungs with the scent of pine and damp earth, Willow stepped out. The soft forest floor yielded beneath her paws, a sensation so different from the unyielding concrete. She took a few tentative steps, then another, a nascent curiosity replacing her apprehension. Walter sat on a fallen log a little distance away, his guitar resting across his lap, playing a soft, melodic tune, the Willow song he'd composed just for her. Willow explored, a hesitant dance with freedom. She sniffed at moss-covered rocks, pawed at a patch of wildflowers, and cautiously approached the clear, rushing stream, lapping at the cool water. Every new sensation was a revelation, a rediscovery of her true nature. Walter watched, a quiet joy expanding in his chest. He saw not the broken animal he had met months ago, but a magnificent creature reclaiming her birthright. The first few weeks were a delicate balance. Walter visited daily, sometimes just sitting quietly, sometimes playing his guitar, always leaving behind a small offering of apples or berries. Willow's explorations grew bolder, her movements more fluid, her coat gleaming with health. The park biologists, monitoring her remotely, reported increasing signs of natural foraging and denning behaviors. She was adapting, slowly but surely. One afternoon, as Walter played, Willow approached him, not with the hesitant wariness she once displayed, but with an almost playful curiosity. She nudged his hand with her snout, a gentle request for the apple he held. As she munched on it contentedly, Walter felt a familiar ache in his heart, the knowledge that this precious connection, so vital to both their healing, would soon need to loosen. The day came for his last visit. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Walter played Willow's song one final time, the notes carrying a bittersweet farewell. Willow listened, her intelligent eyes fixed on him. When he finished, she rose and approached him, rubbing her head against his leg as a house cat might, a profound gesture of affection. Walter knelt, burying his face in her thick fur, the warmth of her body a comfort against his own quiet sorrow. "Be free, Willow," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Live the life you were always meant to live." He stood, his heart heavy but resolute. As he walked away, he didn't look back until he reached the edge of the clearing. Willow was still there, watching him. He raised a hand in a silent goodbye, and then, with a grace he had never seen in her before, she turned and disappeared into the dense undergrowth, swallowed by the wilderness. Walter continued to volunteer at Evergreen, his experience with Willow forever changing his approach to animal rehabilitation. He spoke about her with reverence, a testament to the transformative power of patience and understanding. He still carried his guitar, sometimes playing soft melodies for the new, traumatized animals that arrived at the sanctuary, hoping to offer them the same solace he had given Willow. Months later, a park biologist sent Howard a grainy trail camera photo. It showed a large, healthy black bear, her fur glossy and thick, standing at the edge of a sun-dappled meadow, a faint, almost imperceptible scar visible on her right foreleg. "Willow," She was thriving, a wild spirit returned to her rightful place. Howard showed the photo to Walter. The old man's eyes welled up, a soft smile gracing his lips. He finally understood that letting go wasn't an end, but a new beginning. He had given Willow her freedom, and in doing so, had found his own. His grief for Sarah would always be a part of him, but now, intertwined with it, was the enduring hope and quiet joy that Willow had brought back into his life. He picked up his guitar, and for the first time in a long time, he played a song not of farewell, but of gratitude, a melody of healing and the boundless, beautiful wild. What do you think Willow's favorite part of her new life in the wilderness was?